What happens when a so-called prince is stripped of the very word that props up his hollow existence? Ah, my dear, it is not just a question, it is a sledgehammer swung straight at the brittle skull of monarchy itself. Imagine the centuries of moth-eaten tradition, the grandiloquent rituals puffed up with powdered wigs and stale pomp, all collapsing like a rotting stage. Prop the moment someone dares whisper, "You are no longer a prince." This isn't palace gossip. This isn't a playful little spat over tiaras and protocol. This is the kind of absurdity that belongs in a psychiatric case study of royal delusion. It is the theatre of the grotesque, the spectacle of privilege imploding under its own laughable weight. Enter the poster child of this fast Prince Harry spawn of the Windsor Photo Factory, a man whose personality has been so thoroughly outsourced to tabloids and Netflix scripts that without the word prince glued to his forehead, he is just another lost aristocrat fumbling through podcasts and pity parties. Strip away the title, and what remains? A confused man-child clutching at victimhood like it's a security blanket. The crown gave him meaning, and without it, he is about as regal as a wet sponge. And the thought that this golden boy of privilege might lose the one syllable that keeps him marketable, delicious, hilarious, catastrophic, a nuclear scandal in the world of pomp and pretense. Imagine the historical annals, the day a prince became a punchline. A chapter so jaw-droppingly asinine that even Shakespeare, with all his kings and tragedies, would throw down his quill in disgust and mutter, "Too ridiculous even for me." So buckle up. Watch as this comedy of errors tumbles forward, dragging centuries of royal self-importance into the mud. Because when the magic word evaporates, when the divine smoke and mirrors vanish, all that remains is a man stripped bare, exposed as ordinary, and that is the one fate a Windsor cannot bear. And, before you grab your pearls and faint at the audacity of such truth bombs, do yourself a favour. Hammer that like button until your screen cracks. Subscribe as though your very dignity depends on it. And smash that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in this tragicomic demolition of monarchy's most pathetic soap opera. The decree from Buckingham Palace. Oh, it landed with all the warmth of a guillotine blade. Short, cold, almost gleefully cruel, surgical, in the way a chainsaw is surgical. Forget the polite pageantry, the sugar-dusted nonsense about duty and heritage. No, this was a naked shiv to the ribs, a butchered facelift with no anaesthesia and no apology. The royal scribes dressed it up in pompous phrasing, but the message was blindingly clear. Protect the dignity of the monarchy, as if that word hasn't already been dragged through decades of divorce scandals, sweaty television interviews, and racist dog whistles. And oh, the hypocrisy sings louder than a Westminster choir. For generations the royal spawn have been spoon-fed from birth the lie that their titles are sacrosanct, divine, eternal, little crowns stitched into their very DNA. A birthright, a golden key to the kingdom of smug superiority. And then snap, with a flick of a pen and the smug grin of bureaucratic vengeance, King Charles himself, yes, the eternal understudy, finally wearing the costume of king, shatters his son's gilded security blanket. The irony is so thick it could choke a corgi. Unprecedented, darling. Unprecedented is too polite a word. Even the abdication of Edward VIII, a man who torched his crown for love, looks noble by comparison. Edward chose his fate. Harry, if the whispers are to be believed, gets stripped of his title, like a toddler having his rattle yanked away for throwing a tantrum. One abdicated for passion, the other is humiliated out of pure spite. Call it punishment, call it theatre, but it reeks of desperation from a monarchy terrified of its own irrelevance. And the timing, oh, that's the real punchline. Why now? Why Harry? Why this circus act in the twilight years of Charles's fragile reign? This is the spare heir we're talking about. The boy who trudged behind his mother's coffin while a nation sobbed, the boy saddled with trauma so public, became a grotesque national ritual. That boy grew up in the shadow of a system that commodified his grief only to be crowned black sheep by the same gilded cage that fattened him. And now the monarchy rewards his defiance with a public flogging dressed up as constitutional housekeeping. Strip away the polished rhetoric, and what's left is a pitiful truth. This isn't about dignity. It's about control, revenge, and a rotting institution lashing out at the easiest target in its crumbling family drama. This grotesque circus didn't combust in a single night. It's the rancid harvest of years of petty feuds, ugly rebellions, and melodramatic breakdowns staged for a world half amused, half appalled. To the gullible masses, Harry was the lovable rogue, the soldier prince, the relatable royal, the bloke who smiled through the suffocating starch of Windsor etiquette. But inside those suffocating corridors, the courtiers whispered another narrative. A walking liability, a human grenade with the pin half pulled, a loose cannon, primed to shred their fairy tale of divine majesty into tabloid, confetti. And now their paranoia has finally exploded into a spectacle of vindictive pageantry. So here's the jagged little question: can a title be revoked, like a library card shredded like junk mail? Or is it welded into the veins with the blue blood they fetishize? If you're born a prince, can a cranky proclamation truly bleach it from existence? The palace shrieks yes, with all the shaky authority of a cornered alley cat hissing and scratching to keep its myth alive. But history laughs in their powdered faces. For centuries, disgraced royals, adulterers, traitors, degenerates were shoved into obscurity. Yes, but their titles clung stubbornly, festering like a bad tattoo. Erased. Almost never. And that's why this grotesque charade rattles the teacups like a political earthquake. It isn't just Harry. It's the monarchy drunk on its own panic, scribbling new rules on a cocktail napkin, spray painting over centuries of supposed tradition, and flailing like a spooked porcupine in a cage of its own making. This isn't regal reform. It's raw desperation, the gasping death rattle of an institution terrified of becoming the punchline it already is. Oh, the irony doesn't just drip, it floods, drowns and chokes on its own absurdity. In their panicked pirouette to preserve dignity, these royals are not dodging disaster, they're pouring gasoline on the inferno. It's a grotesque ballet of self-sabotage, a tragic comedy so raw it makes Shakespeare's darkest kings look like children's puppets. Picture it. Harry stripped not in some gilt chamber buzzing with lackeys, but as a husband, a father, a man marooned thousands of miles away, learning his fate not with ceremony, but with cruelty. No fanfare, no velvet cushion, just the icy clang of demotion. His name, once inflated with pomp, punctured into common clay. His ego, flattened under the monarchy's heel, like a discarded cigarette. The tears, if they came, weren't delicate handkerchief dabs. They were the howls of someone watching his identity diced up for sport. Yes, Harry blundered. Yes, he whined, sparred, overshared. But here's the filthy truth. He was born into this carnival against his will, shoved on stage as a prop, and now he's being booted off like a bad clown after the crowd stops laughing. This isn't just scandal. It's patricide in slow motion, a father-son demolition derby staged in front of billions. And the king, King Charles, the man who waited a lifetime to grasp the crown, like a dog gnawing a bone, dares insist this isn't revenge, but duty. The crown must endure, he intones, as if the monarchy were a noble flame instead of a smoke machine pumping out centuries of hypocrisy. Spare us the sermon. Is this duty or festering spite? Is this stewardship or punishment for Harry's volcanic tell-alls? The memoir dripping with poison, the interviews exposing royal rot, the documentaries framing Buckingham as a medieval dungeon in modern drag. Some insist Harry played his hand too hard, cornered the family like a reckless gambler, and left them no choice. Others sneer it's pure vengeance, Charles clutching the crown with one hand and slapping his son with the other. Either way, the nation and the world are split down the middle like a carcass on the butcher's block. Harry's disciples call him the brave escapee from a toxic cult. The monarchists howl. He's a Judas hammering nails into the House of Windsor like it's his personal crucifix. And therein lies the irresistible chaos. Two camps, shrieking, sobbing, dissecting every blink, every syllable, every twitch, like deranged jurors in a never-ending trial. The result, that sterile little proclamation from the palace, detonated not like a decree, but like dynamite in a cathedral, sacred walls, trembling stained glass, shattered echoes of betrayal rattling across the globe. This isn't just a royal rift. This is the monarchy gnawing its own bones, while the world watches popcorn in hand. Oh, savour the venomous choreography of the timing. Just as Harry and Meghan cocooned themselves in their Hollywood hideaway curtains, drawn cameras cooling the monarchy, ever addicted to its own melodrama, jerked the drapes wide open and hurled this grenade into the silence. Tactical masterstroke, or royal temper tantrum? Was it a calculated chess move to neuter the rogue royals, or just a petty post-it note scrawled to Harry Times, "You're out, permanently, peasant asterisk"? And that, dear Gawkers, births the dread-laced dilemma if they'll maul their Time's own bloodline. Time's what fresh atrocities will they conjure to defend their dusty dominion? History. If you haven't whitewashed, it hisses warnings. Edward VIII's abdication rattled the throne. Diana's defiance detonated its sanctimony. Andrew's scandals nearly scorched it to ashes. Yet never, never has a monarch stooped to publicly plucking a child's title like a schoolyard bully ripping badges off a Boy Scout. The symbolism slashes deeper than ceremony. The crown crushes kin. Loyalty is forfeit. Love is collateral damage. Drag that nightmare into your own life. What if your father decreed your very essence deleted? Not just disinvited from Christmas dinner, but scrubbed from existence, your name, your identity vaporized. Could you forgive? Could you crawl back? Or would you seethe forever? That's Harry's horror, not the silly suffix, but the lifetime of wounds, climaxing in one devastating decree. And Charles R. Charles, the monarch who pitted diadem against DNA. He crowned the crown, not the sun. Did he imagine himself guardian of the sceptre, or merely a sulking patriarch protecting his brittle ego? Historians will quarrel across centuries, but the truth festers in the silences. The venomous letters never leaked the screaming matches, never recorded. And you can bet somewhere, in some sealed vault, lies a missive, a memo, a molten manifesto, waiting to erupt like a scandal volcano. When times, not if times, that leaks the inferno will incinerate more than one Windsor. Make no mistake, this decree is no closing chapter. It's the pilot episode, the opening act, the fuse lit on a saga of implosions. Today, it's titles. Tomorrow, the whole tawdry tale of monarchy's fragile fiction, unravelling thread by golden thread. This isn't Harry losing a label, it's the monarchy losing its mask. And the sequel, mark my words, will be bloodier, louder, and far more humiliating than any Windsor wants to imagine. The edict itself, terse as a tyrant's tweet, sharp as a guillotine in a velvet glove. For the first time in modern mayhem, a royal rank wasn't simply scorned, it was severed, brutally, publicly. Titles, you see, aren't mere baubles of etiquette, they're shackles of fate, shackles of spectacle. Strip them and you strip the illusion, leaving behind not royalty, but rubble. History offers its grim ledger. Prince was never just a cradle gift. It once meant dominion swords and sovereign power. Over centuries, it warped into inheritance and indoctrination, born royal, die royal, no matter the scandal. Edward VIII surrendered a throne for love, but clung to his Royal Highness like a drowning man clutching driftwood. He was diminished, yes, but never deleted. Harry's saga, a cataclysm without precedent. Not tweaked, not tempered, torched. The monarchy didn't prune a branch, it set the whole tree ablaze. Why such ferocity? It reeks of a seismic shift in Windsor warfare. A dynasty so desperate to preserve itself, it cannibalizes its own. This isn't continuity. This is carnage dressed in ermine. And it screams the monarchy cornered is devouring its children to survive. Tradition that cobwebbed cloak the crown wraps around its sins has always tolerated trimming, tweaking, tucking, titles into shadows, but total obliteration, taboo beyond belief. Even Andrew, marinated in muck and mired in monstrous allegations, clings to Prince like a cursed amulet. Patronages, pillaged honours, hacked away duties dumped on the dung heap, yet the designation survives. If he keeps it, why is Harry singled out for this savage harvest? What cosmic crime did he commit that trumps treason, sleaze, or sheer disgrace? The contradictions coil like a nest of vipers. The palace puffs up its chest, bleating about dignity, about titles as prizes earned through toil and loyalty. But history is a sewer, overflowing with royal sins, adultery, greed, betrayal, even flirtations with treason, and those offenders swanned about unscathed. Still princes, still highnesses. So, is this really about principle? Or is it punishment and execution by semantics meant to terrify every blue blood who dares to buck the beast? And oh, savour the smug sermon, titles earned, not defaulted from DNA. That isn't an edict, it's a wrecking ball. For centuries, heredity handed down rank like party favours. Now, one frosty sentence somersaults sanctity itself. The new gospel, no birth bonus, no automatic benediction. Fail to bow and scrape, and you're not just scolded, you're banished, erased, atomised. Imagine the psychic earthquake. Harry gilded from cradle, groomed daily in genuflections, ribbons, rituals, reverences, trained to believe his very breath was branded with royalty. Decades of delusion detonated in an instant. Told you're not worthy of Prince after a life lived as one. The cruelty is Shakespearean. The public divides, some cheer the discipline, others wince at the savagery, but either way, the spectacle sears. And history whispers the echoes. Diana, stripped of HRH after divorce, wasn't erased, merely paired. She remained Princess of Wales, dignity dented but not demolished. Harry's case, an attempted annihilation. Not a pruning, but a purge. To brand him non-prince is to recast him as a royal, reject a ghost wandering outside the gates. And the bitter irony, stripping the title could strengthen him. Titles tether to tedium, yes, but without them, Harry might vault beyond the monarchy's straitjacket. Charles's strike, meant to silence, may only magnify the noise. And now, audience, I turn to you. If you wore Harry's boots, would you battle for the bauble clutching that crown-born claim? Or would you hurl it back, sneering your endorsement? Expendable, that tension between craving court and courting chaos is the heart of this grotesque saga. Make no mistake, this isn't refinement. It's revolution in ermine. A monarchy baring its fangs, not just at Harry, but at the very idea of family loyalty. Strip away the pomp and what remains, a clan cannibalising itself. And history offers grim warnings. Monarchies that erased their own banished daughters, silenced sons, disinherited brothers, often cracked apart. The Romanovs wiped out, the Bourbons butchered. Even Britain knows Lady Jane Grey executed in a power struggle, James II exiled into ignominy, each erasure rippled outward into chaos. Because, in the end, titles are never just about one man. They are about the monarchy's myth. And right now, that myth reeks of cruelty, rigidity, vengeance. A crown colder than stone, clutched tighter as its meaning crumbles. Ah, but here's where the plot curdles into pure tragedy. The stripping of Harry's title doesn't exist in a vacuum. It ricochets forward, casting a grim shadow over Archie and Lilibet. If titles must now be earned, what becomes of them? Are they heirs to nothing? Phantoms in the lineage, scrubbed out before they even understand what's been denied? This is no slap. It's a seismic precedent. Because once a crown confesses that titles are fragile, arbitrary paper-thin things that vanish with a single flourish of a pen, the illusion of permanence disintegrates. And when the illusion shatters, the monarchy's value plummets to dust. If a prince can stop being a prince, then what honestly is the monarchy worth? And that is the razor-edged question slicing through this saga. Why now? Why Harry? Why this brutal stroke, while others wallow in scandal unscathed? Was it dignity, as Charles and his courtiers claim? Or was it fury, betrayal, and personal humiliation finally boiling over? Consider Charles's position. 70 years he waited longer than any heir in history, living as a man in waiting, mocked as the eternal understudy. When the crown finally landed on his head, the assignment was simple. Steady, the ship preserve the myth, honour the legacy. Instead, he inherited chaos. Andrew, a walking disgrace. Meghan and Harry detonating bombs across the Atlantic, and every headline dripping poison onto his reign before it even steadied. How much venom can one man swallow before he spits it back? It wasn't one betrayal. It was 1,000. Oprah with accusations of racism. Netflix painting the monarchy as a mausoleum of cruelty. Spare where Harry branded Charles Cold William violent, the institution suffocating. Each revelation a dagger, each broadcast a wound. By the time whispers turned into roaring scrutiny, Charles was cornered. Protect the monarchy or perish with it. But here's the grotesque irony in stripping Harry of his title. Charles may have proven Harry right. Harry shouted that the monarchy prizes optics over love, loyalty over family. And now, with one signature, Charles carved those accusations into marble. He chose crown over son perception over paternity, strong, or cowardly, masquerading as strong. Imagine the scene: Charles at his desk papers, arrayed courtiers murmuring William's fury hanging in the air, Camilla's quiet insistence shaping his resolve. He signs, a single stroke, cold and clinical, and with it, his son becomes plain Harry. The boy he once gripped by the hand at Diana's funeral, reduced to a name with no title, no shield, not just erased in paperwork, erased in bloodline meaning, and the emotional carnage, irreparable. How does a father sit across from a son he has publicly annihilated? How do you return to any semblance of family after turning kin into casualty? Perhaps Charles has already accepted the answer you don't. Perhaps in his mind, Harry is no longer son, but subject another noisy rebel to be subdued by the crown's might. But insiders murmur another tale, that Charles agonised, that he wept in private, that he never wanted this but was shackled by the machinery of monarchy, that the institution demanded the sacrifice, not the man. If true, Charles isn't executioner, but prisoner caged by his own crown, forced to betray his blood to uphold a hollow throne. And Harry. The fallout was raw, not stiff stoicism, not rehearsed restraint, real grief. The collapse of a man who realised his identity had been torn out by the roots. They say he wept not camera tears, but guttural sobs, not for a title, but for family, for connection, for the last thread binding him to the world he once belonged to, Betrayal, humiliation, heartbreak, it all poured out. But tears were only the prologue. Behind them came rage, and behind rage came fear. And then Meghan, the partner who has always been more strategist than spouse, the shield at his side, the whisperer of courage when the crown sharpened its claws. If Harry crumbled, Meghan moved. And her next moves, make no mistake, will set the stage for the sequel to this sordid saga. Whispers curled through the palace corridors like smoke. Was it Meghan? The courtiers muttered it in private. The tabloids screamed it in print. The king's fury, the son's disgrace, was it her shadow that drove it all? In their telling, Meghan is the catalyst of collapse, the serpent who lured Harry from Eden, the schemer who dared to teach a prince the vocabulary of rebellion. Convenient, isn't it? When a 1,000-year-old institution trembles, it points not at its own cracks, but at the outsider who dared to enter. Because to the monarchy's loyalists, Meghan is more than a duchess. She is disruption personified. Too American, too direct, too unwilling to bow without question. Qualities adored in California, treated as poison in courtly Britain. The courtiers never forgave her, and when Harry followed her across the Atlantic, the story hardened like wet cement. He would never have left on his own. She pulled him away. But was that truth or camouflage? Harry himself had been restless long before Meghan. He said it plainly. The institution suffocated him, the spare condemned to permanent shadow. He wanted more than medals, and photo ops more than being his brother's insurance policy. Meghan didn't invent Harry's discontent. She amplified it, mirrored it, gave it focus. She was not the fire, but the spark to a tinderbox already stacked high. And that is why the question, was Meghan the cause or the scapegoat, cut so deep? Because blaming her absolves everyone else. It absolves Charles of a father's failures. It absolves William of a brother's brutality. It absolves the institution of its cruelty. It was Meghan, they say, because that is simpler than admitting the monarchy devours its own. Yet behind the walls of Montecito insiders paint another picture. Meghan, far from plotting Harry's downfall, became his lifeline. When the palace stripped his title, she was the one who steadied him. She whispered, "They can take the title, but they can't take you. Not rebellion, reassurance, not manipulation, survival." To Harry, she was not the cause of his ruin, but the only reason he was still standing at all. Still, perception is its own weapon. And in the battle of narratives, Meghan remains the lightning rod. The monarchy knows it. The tabloids thrive on it. Every attack on Harry ricochets onto her. Every punishment he suffers is framed as her fault. And perhaps that was the quietest calculation in Charles's brutal stroke. Not only to discipline his son, but to isolate Meghan further, to ensure that history records her as the woman who cost a prince his crown. But here lies the deeper danger. If Meghan is the scapegoat, then this drama is not truly about her. It is about the monarchy's desperate need to preserve itself by sacrificing someone, anyone, on its altar. Diana once filled that role. Now it is Meghan. And tomorrow, who will it be? Archie Lilibet. The cycle devours whoever the story demands. So let me leave you with this chilling possibility. Meghan wasn't the cause. She wasn't even the scapegoat. She was the warning. The embodiment of what happens when someone refuses to play by the palace's rules. And Harry has now seen exactly what the crown is willing to do, not just to him, but to the woman he loves. And that knowledge, more than titles or tears, may shape his next move. And that more than Meghan's presence, more than the palace whispers, is the jagged shard lodged in the monarchy's throat. Dysfunction isn't scandal. Scandal they can survive. Indeed, they have thrived on it. Adultery, abdication affairs with convicted men, scandals titillate and then time dulls them. But dysfunction, that's poison. Because dysfunction reduces the monarchy to what it dreads most. A family, like any other, riddled with resentments, rivalries, jealousies, the mystique evaporates, and once it's gone, so too is the magic that keeps the crown on its pedestal. Harry, through Oprah, through Netflix, through Spare, didn't just break the family code, he punctured the illusion. He took what was supposed to be myth, his father, the stoic monarch, in waiting, his brother, the dutiful heir, and he revealed them as men, flawed, distant, sometimes cruel, ordinary men wrapped in extraordinary privilege. And in doing so, he didn't merely damage the institution's image, he threatened its very reason for existing. Now, picture Charles seated under the weight of that revelation. For 70 years, he studied the throne, dreamed of restoring dignity after the turbulence of Diana, Camilla, Andrew. At last the crown is his, and instead of respect, he inherits ridicule. Instead of reverence, he is painted as the cold father of a broken son. Harry didn't just write stories. He wrote a new narrative, a monarchy stripped of mystique, a monarchy that bleeds like everyone else. And that's why Charles struck, not because of Meghan's influence, not because of a single interview, but because Harry dared to expose the monarchy as human. That was the true, irreparable damage. For an institution built on divine aura to be seen as ordinary is to be seen as unnecessary, and Charles knew it. The title wasn't revoked merely as punishment, it was erased as if to say, this man, this storyteller, this rebel is no longer royal. His words no longer represent us. His blood no longer binds us. But here's the paradox. In stripping Harry's title, Charles may have proven his son's point. He showed the world that blood is conditional, that family bends to institution, that the crown always devours its own. He thought he was silencing Harry. Instead, he may have handed him the most powerful proof yet that the monarchy is not love, not loyalty, not legacy, it is survival at any cost. And that brings us to the darkest question yet. If this was the line Charles drew against his son, what line will he draw against the public? Against critics? Against the tide of history itself? Because if Harry can be erased, what else is expendable in service of the crown? And that's where the tragedy tightens its grip. Because this wasn't just Charles the father wounding his son, it was William the brother tightening the vice. A double betrayal, a crown-sanctioned crucifixion, with family hammers pounding the nails. Insiders murmur that William's fury wasn't a passing blaze, it was a slow-burning fire, stoked for years. Every headline Harry generated scorched William's image. Every revelation in Spare made him look less like the noble heir and more like the tyrant brother. And William, ever the image-conscious future king, couldn't let that perception harden into history. To him, Harry's freedom was treason and silence was complicity. So the calculus became brutal sacrifice. One brother to safeguard the other, strip the spare to fortify the heir. It's a chilling symmetry, what Diana feared all along, that the crown would consume her boys, pit them against each other, and devour their bond to preserve itself. But here's the unspoken twist. By forcing Charles's hand, William may have shifted the monarchy's future in ways even he can't control. Because once you make an enemy of your brother, you don't just lose a sibling, you create an adversary with nothing left to lose. And Harry cut loose from title tether and tradition is more dangerous than ever. No longer bound by royal rules, he can speak without restraint. He can reveal, without fear of betraying the crown, because the crown betrayed him first. Which leaves us with the cruelest irony of all. William may have won the battle, but in doing so, he may have ignited a war. A war that isn't just brother against brother, but heir against spare, duty against defiance, silence against truth. And history has seen this play before. Cain and Abel, Edward and George, Richard and his rivals. Brotherly blood feuds don't just scar families, they scar nations. If William truly demanded Harry's erasure, then the Crown's greatest threat may not be scandal Meghan or even Harry's memoirs. It may be the wrath of a brother cast into exile, ready to wield his truth like a blade. And that's when the palace realised it had miscalculated. What was meant as a show of strength looked instead like an act of cruelty. The optics were brutal. A father disowning a son, a brother banishing his blood, an institution cutting off the one royal who had actually served on the battlefield. The irony stung. The Crown that had weathered abdications, divorces, scandals, even whispers of treason, was now trembling, not because of Harry's actions, but because of the people's reaction to his punishment. Headlines screamed betrayal. Commentators dissected the symbolism. Social media lit up with hashtags like "Still Our Prince" and "Justice for Harry." Veterans groups released statements defending him, saying, titles or not, Harry would always be one of them. Even those who weren't royalists found themselves stirred, framing the decision as a father turning his back on his child. And when ordinary citizens see cruelty in the Crown, faith in the institution weakens. Inside the palace, aides scrambled. Some argued the backlash would fade, that the people's anger would cool. But others weren't so sure. "This feels different," one insider reportedly whispered. "This feels dangerous." Because it wasn't just about Harry anymore, it was about what the monarchy represented. Was it a family bound by love or a machine powered by cold survival? The public was starting to answer that question for themselves. And here lies the paradox. By stripping Harry of his title, William and Charles may have unintentionally given him a new one, not prince, but people's prince. A man cast out by the Crown, yet embraced more fiercely than ever by the crowd. A living reminder that blood is thicker than protocol, that authenticity outweighs tradition. But this story doesn't stop at sympathy. The anger was coalescing into something larger, something the palace hadn't anticipated a movement. Protesters weren't just defending Harry, they were questioning the monarchy itself. If they can do this to him, one sign read, "Why should we trust them at all?" And in those chants, in those headlines, in that groundswell of emotion, the real nightmare for William and Charles began to crystallise. The punishment meant to protect the monarchy might in the end be the very act that undermines it. That question echoed through the crowd like a drumbeat of rebellion, a pounding rhythm of disbelief and rage. And yet, on the other side of the divide, the noise was just as venomous. Some sneered that it was long overdue. Asterisk. You cannot gorge yourself on royal privilege while spitting venom at the very throne that feeds you, Times bellowed one angry voice in the mob. Asterisk, actions have consequences. Asterisk, punishing. To them, Charles's move wasn't cruelty, it was divine punishment and accountability. Dressed up as justice, they framed it as the monarchy finally standing tall after years of being flogged in the global square, after years of humiliation that made the Crown look less like an institution and more like a circus act. The split was jagged, violent, impossible to ignore. Streets that once erupted in cheers for weddings and hollow jubilees, now pulsed with fury and fracture, turned into arenas of ideological warfare. Social media ignited like dry tinder in a wildfire. Hashtags screamed across timelines. Times, not my prince. Times, clashing head-on with Times justice for Harry. Asterisk, memes flew like poisoned arrows. Petitions multiplied like weeds. TikToks dissected every syllable of the announcement as if it was scripture written in blood. The youth rallied hardest seeing in Harry, a mirror of their own battles against suffocating traditions, toxic families, and institutions so ancient they reek of dust. The older generations, loyal lapdogs of the Crown, croaked that Harry had betrayed his birthright. Betrayed what exactly? A gilded prison, a masquerade of virtue, and then came the media firestorm, an inferno gleefully stoked by the British tabloids. They slobbered over the carcass like vultures. Asterisk Prince no more Times shrieked one front page. Asterisk Harry the Commoner Times jeered another. The language was cruel, dripping with mockery, sharpened to wound. Their knives were out, and Harry was the feast. Yet, across the Atlantic, the tune changed. American outlets painted him not as a traitor, but as a victim, a casualty of an archaic dynasty hell-bent on eating its own. In Canada, in Australia, across Europe, the verdict splintered. Some mocked, some mourned, all argued. The monarchy's facade of untouchable reverence cracked like cheap plaster under a storm. And here's where the bitter irony burned hottest. The louder the public roared, the more visibly the palace squirmed. The monarchy was supposed to be the temple of unity, stability, and timeless tradition. Instead, Charles's decree exposed it for what it was: brittle, divided, and terrified. The attempt to muzzle Harry only amplified his voice. They tried to bury him. Instead, they handed him a resurrection, soaked in public sympathy. So, I put it to you, whose side do you take? The Crown, a parasitic institution clawing at its crumbling dignity, or Harry, the cast-off son, the man stripped of the one word that had shackled him since birth? The question is toxic, radioactive, and irresistible. That is why the public reaction was not just electric, it was volcanic. This wasn't just Harry's battle. It was a referendum on what the monarchy represents in the modern world: relevance or rot. And then came the image, the one that sliced deeper than any headline. Outside Buckingham Palace, a group of Harry's supporters, veterans, in uniform medals, gleaming faces grim, stood in the pouring rain, holding placards that declared times he served, he sacrificed. He deserves better. Asterisk. No chants, no noise, just a wall of silent contempt. That photograph went viral, ricocheting across the globe, shared tens of millions of times. A dagger in the monarchy's chest. Because no matter how they spun it, no matter how they spat out their justifications, the truth glared back. Harry had bled for his country, while many who clung to their titles had never lifted a finger beyond raising a glass of champagne. The ripple effect was immediate and merciless. Charities Harry had poured himself into publicly sided with him. Celebrities unleashed tirades, some torching the monarchy as a relic, others grovelling in defence of the institution. Politicians were dragged into the inferno, forced to comment. Some slithered away, dodging responsibility. Others sharpened the moment into a weapon, using it to question whether Britain should continue propping up this golden corpse called monarchy at all. What began as a family squabble metastasised into a national crisis, a global referendum. The palace, for all its centuries of stage-managed control, could do nothing but watch as its grip slipped further with every headline, every protest, every tweet. They thought they were extinguishing Harry. Instead, they lit a bonfire beneath their own throne. They tried to strip him of power, but in their arrogance they gave him a megaphone the size of the world. They tried to shame him into silence, but instead they turned him into a martyr. A rebel saint crowned not by bloodlines, but by public fury. And here comes the twist you never saw coming. The punishment meant to erase Harry may very well be the very thing that erases them. While the world was erupting in rage, while social media scorched itself into frenzy, and crowds howled outside palace gates, whispers slithered through the air, dark, heavy, undeniable. Whispers that this scandal was no longer Britain's dirty laundry alone. It had detonated far beyond London's grey skies. This was no longer a family squabble. It was global theatre, a blood-soaked spectacle, and the world was pulling up a chair to watch the monarchy cannibalise itself. The moment Buckingham Palace confirmed that Harry's title was gone, international reaction ripped through the air like a chain of fireworks, deafening and unstoppable. The monarchy has always marketed itself as a global brand, as much as a family, a crown on tour, a fairy tale exported for profit. But this grotesque act of erasure turned that brand into a lightning rod of ridicule and disgust. In the United States, the coverage was instant and merciless. Networks carved out hours of airtime dissecting the fallout. Talk shows asked bluntly times, did Britain just exile Diana's son all over again? Times columnists branded Charles's move cruel, unnecessary, and breathtakingly reckless, a gamble so idiotic it might topple the entire monarchy. And in California, where Harry and Meghan now live, the outrage was deafening. Americans saw the decision not as discipline, but as vindictive punishment, the silencing of a man who dared to speak truth. And in a nation that clawed its freedom away from the crown over 2 centuries ago, the irony tasted sweet and poisonous. Across Europe, the responses were jagged and biting. In France and Germany, commentators scoffed at the absurdity of a royal house clinging to medieval theatrics. The British monarchy, they said, looked like a relic thrashing in its death throes, punishing a man not for crimes but for daring to live freely. Meanwhile, in Spain, Denmark and the Netherlands, nations still shackled to their own thrones, the reactions were more anxious. Royals there watched like cornered animals. If Britain could cut a prince down, what stopped their own crowns from being sliced to ribbons next? And then came the Commonwealth. Canada, Australia, New Zealand nations still forced to bow to a king across the sea. Politicians were pressed-cornered, demanded for answers. In Australia, Republicans pounced snarling that if the monarchy could butcher one of its own, it deserved no loyalty from nations half a world away. In Canada, headlines debated whether Charles had crossed a moral Rubicon. In the Caribbean, where anger toward the crown already boils, the announcement was treated as proof, carved in stone, the monarchy protects only itself, never its people. Perhaps most damning of all, though, were the hushed murmurs leaking from other royal houses. A senior figure in one European court whispered that Britain had smashed an unspoken law that blood, once royal, is times always times royal, no matter how ugly the scandal. Another voice, cloaked in careful diplomacy, suggested Charles had revealed weakness, not strength. Because if a king cannot even keep his own family from splintering apart, how can he possibly keep a nation together? But behind the drama, something even darker churned. Diplomats, quietly frantic, began to fret. The monarchy isn't just a family circus. It is a symbol, the face Britain parades before the world. And now that face looked twisted, bitter, cannibalistic. Foreign leaders asked the question Britain could not bear to face. Was this the sign of a strong monarch drawing hard boundaries, or of a fragile old man lashing out at his son in a fit of fear? Perception matters. In diplomacy, perception is everything. And a monarch who looks weak, erratic, vengeful, that perception curdles into instability, into doubt, into risk. But strip away politics, and something rawer remained. The world wasn't just watching a monarchy implode, it was watching Diana's boy, motherless since childhood, cast out by the very blood meant to protect him. That image, that grief, that betrayal, those things transcended borders. They cut deeper than tradition, louder than pomp. Humanity, not ceremony, became the story. And humanity always wins. Now picture Harry in that moment, sitting in California, staring at television screens, splashed with his face from New York to Paris. Hearing American talk show hosts defend him, French commentators sneer at his father, Australian politicians question the crown's very legitimacy, vindication, terror, likely, both swirling in the same breath. Because the truth slammed into him like a tidal wave, this was no longer personal. His feud with the monarchy had gone global. And then the story sharpened into an even deadlier twist. While the world bickered about, morality legal experts crept onto the stage, knives gleaming. Could the king even do this? Did Charles actually possess the constitutional authority to strip his son's birthright? Or had he, in his desperation, overstepped, triggering a legal earthquake that might shake his reign to its very core? The question was simple, yet lethal times. Can a king truly erase what blood itself has bestowed times? That was the echo, not just in homes and headlines, but in the chambers of lawyers, constitutional scholars, and members of parliament. Because while Buckingham Palace's statement had been clipped cold and final times, Harry's title revoked times the ground beneath that proclamation was anything but solid. Some argued Charles hadn't just crossed a line. He had stepped straight into quicksand. Let's tear this apart. Royal titles in Britain are not party favours to be handed out or snatched back at a monarch's whim. They are shackled to centuries of precedent, custom, and law. A prince is not styled, so for decoration it is recognition of birth, of lineage, of blood itself. So, for Charles to declare his son no longer prince raised an explosive question. Did he truly wield that authority? Or had he blundered into overreach that could poison his reign forever? History weighed in. The letters patent of 1917, issued by King George V, carved rules in stone. And those rules may prove the very trap Charles now finds snapping shut beneath his feet. All sons and daughters of the sovereign are entitled to the style of prince or princess. It is not a courtesy. It is not a privilege. It is a right carved into the very marrow of bloodline. By that measure, on paper and in flesh, Harry was born a prince unshakable, undeniable. For Charles to claw that title away, he needs more than a petty press release typed by trembling courtiers. He may need Parliament. He may need an act of law. Without it, critics howl his decree is little more than theatre, symbolic at best, unconstitutional at worst. But here lies the contradiction, the hypocrisy that festers in the monarchy's bones. Rules have always been bent, bruised, mutilated when the institution demanded it. Edward VIII, after torching his throne for love, was dressed up as Duke of Windsor, his children barred from royal status, punished for sins they never committed. Andrew Charles's own disgraced brother was stripped of duties and patronages, but curiously left to swan around, with his title intact, a rancid reminder of selective punishment. Diana was robbed of her royal highness, but still remained Princess of Wales, a ghost, haunting the crown until her final breath. Rules flex, rules fracture, and yet rules matter. And by lunging at Harry's birthright, Charles may have opened the gates to a legal reckoning that could detonate in his face with biblical fury. Picture the scene, constitutional lawyers clawing through dusty tomes, debating on prime-time television whether a king can erase blood with ink. Some argue, yes, sovereign supremacy cloaks Charles in untouchable authority. Others scoff no crown, no matter how heavy, can blot out lineage. Blood is not ink, blood cannot be revoked by decree. And swirling above it all, the public screams the real question: if Harry can be stripped, who is next? Archie Lilibet. Even William, should he one day cross tradition, the precedent is poison. If titles are conditional, then the crown's so-called permanence is nothing but papier-mâché ready to dissolve in the rain. And so I ask you, should any monarch wield such grotesque power over family, over blood, over identity itself? Or should there be limits, checks, balances? This question doesn't just nip at the monarchy, it rips it open. Is this law, or is this just theatre, dressed in robes and dripping gold? The implications spiral further. If Charles has indeed overreached, Harry may have a case to drag his father's crown into the very courts of Britain. Imagine the irony: Harry the Prince, who walked away, forced to crawl back into the lion's den to defend the title he never even wanted. Would he fight, staking his claim as a son wronged, or would he sneer, letting the crown clutch its hollow prize, while he wears exile as a badge of honour? That choice alone could sculpt his legacy like stone. But the shadow stretches further into international law. In America, Harry's adopted homeland titles mean nothing but pageantry. They are empty symbolic. But in Britain, titles are woven into the very constitution. If Charles has bent or broken that fabric, he risks not just a family scandal, but a constitutional crisis. Already whispers crawl through Parliament MPs shifting in discomfort. If a king can strike down his son's birthright with the stroke of a pen, what else can he seize? What else might he dare? And the unease spreads. Legal scholars warn that such a precedent gnaws at the monarchy's fragile core. If titles can be stripped for damage to the institution, then every royal lies under a permanent guillotine. One wrong word, one misstep, one scandal, and gone. The illusion of permanence. The monarchy's greatest con trick collapses into dust. But here's the darker, more cynical twist. Some insiders whisper Charles does not care if the lawyers come snarling, if Parliament growls, if courts someday overturn him. The legality is irrelevant. The act, the gesture, was the point. By stripping Harry's title, Charles carved his message into stone loyalty is everything, betrayal is death. He does not care if the law laughs at him tomorrow. Tonight, the symbolism cuts like a blade. But symbols like blades cut both ways. While Charles flexes his brittle authority, he has cracked open the one thing the monarchy cannot afford, doubt. And doubt is dynamite. Doubt breeds debate, breeds dissent, breeds whispers of irrelevance that no crown can silence. What happens if the courts weigh in? What happens if Parliament rebels? What happens if, in his desperate bid to silence Harry, Charles instead exposes the fragility of his own reign? And looming above all these burning questions is one tantalising, venomous mystery. Before the public ever glimpsed the official proclamation, would you like me to continue that sentence, unravelling what was hidden before the announcement? The palace manoeuvres, the secrecy, the betrayals whispered in corridors.